Welcome back to World War II TV and our Myths series. And to examine the performance and fighting prowess of the Italian Navy in the war, we have YouTube naval history legend Drachinifel. I said that he just disappeared out of the screen, but he'll come back in again in a minute. The question being, were they really useless? And we will find out shortly with Drac. So there we are, Drac, back again.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there, but there you go. Such is life.
So It's a big discussion. We've talked about it before, but I'm going to hand it over to you to explain this. Were they as bad as people think? You got 20 minutes, folks. If we have time for questions, we'll do them, but we'll see. But over to you,
right. Thank you. So, rapid pitch. Obviously, unfortunately, the Italian armed forces in general in World War II do sometimes get tarred with a very broad brush of being considered pretty much useless and ineffective. Personally, I think this stems from the Italian army in the first part of the war, which, to be honest, didn't cover itself massively in glory, but did get better as time went on. But going over to the Navy, they certainly weren't useless. And I think there's a lot of metrics that you can use to evaluate that. So firstly, obviously, we've got our first slide, which shows some of the rather good-looking units of the Italian Navy. And I think we should first bear in mind the relative balance of forces. So obviously, a lot of people, when you talk about World War II and the Navy, everyone thinks, oh, yes, Bismarck, Kriegsmarine, U-boats, la, la, la. I did a quick size comparison. So using I used the end of the year, so ships that still existed and were in service in the Navy at the end of each given year, while both Germany and Italy were involved in some way in World War II. So some of these ships may be in shipyards being repaired or whatever, but they will be extant at some point. In 1939, you can perhaps think that both Germany and Italy pose a similar threat. They both have two fast battleships. Although the Italians have 7 heavy cruisers, the Germans only have 4, and the Italians have 12 light cruisers, the Germans only have 6. But then the situation gets very much heavily weighted in the Italians' favor. In 1940, they have 6 fast battleships, and in 1941, 42, and 43, they have 5, and that's purely because one of them basically was on the back burner for repairs after Taranto. The Germans cap out in 1940 at 3, Bismarck, Scharnhorst, and Gneisenau. Obviously, Bismarck gets sunk in 1940, so at no point do the Germans ever have more than 3 fast battleships, and by 1942, Gneisenau is out of the running, and by 1943, at the end of the year, Scharnhorst is knocked out of the running, leaving them just with Tirpitz, which is a bit broken. Likewise, heavy cruiser-wise, although they complete Prince Eugen, the Germans never managed to break more than 4 heavy cruisers at any one time. Blucher gets sunk, Grash Bay sunk at the beginning of the war, and the Germans lose 2 light cruisers straight out of the running. So their maximum cruiser strength combined is a total of 8. And the Italians, unlike the Germans, with the exception, obviously, of Prince Eugen, continue to build cruisers, albeit light ones. So they lose 1 in 1940, but that means they still have a total of 18. And this number admittedly does go down as Allied attrition catches up with them. But even by the end of 1943, once the Italians are out of the war, they still have 10 cruisers to the Germans' 8. And as we said, they have the 5 battleships. To that point, the Germans 1 slightly broken Tirpitz. So the Italian Navy is a much larger, much more powerful threat to the Allies. And you start to see this when you have a look at what the plans are at the beginning of World War II. When you look at the Mediterranean fleet, it's pretty much on a par with the home fleet in size. But you also have the Marine Nationale, the French Navy, allocating its most modern units available at the time. So that's the Dunkirk and Strasbourg. They're allocated to the Western Mediterranean. So that tells you where the bulk of Allied naval power is concentrating. Of course, Italy then doesn't get involved for a little bit, and France gets knocked out of the war. But as a result, the Royal Navy has to create Force H. So when you add up Force H and the Mediterranean fleet, you realize that actually, in terms of number of fleet carriers deployed, the Mediterranean theater usually has more carriers available to it than the home fleet does. And they usually have an equal number of battleships on paper, but a larger number of capital ships in practice, because both Force H and the Mediterranean fleet are in Alexandria, are dealing with the Italians pretty much constantly, whereas the home fleet is kind of parceling itself out. A lot of the home fleet capital ships end up running convoy escort missions, which is technically dealing with the Kriegsmarine, but not really. So you see when Bismarck breaks out, the home fleet has one fleet carrier, Victorious, which is pretty much brand new, Prince of Wales, which is also pretty much brand new, probably shouldn't have actually been commissioned at that stage, and Hood and King George V. Whereas at the same time, in 1941, the Mediterranean Fleet and Force H combined actually has a lot more warships. So that's just in terms of size of threat. But when we also look at things like code breaking, the Italians actually have a considerably greater success breaking Allied naval codes than the Germans do. And so they have much better intelligence on what the Allies are doing compared to the Germans. Now, that's not to say the Germans didn't break Allied naval codes, but the Italians had more success, which obviously makes them a slightly bigger threat. You also have to look at the strategic implications. So we already established the Kriegsmarine is a smaller navy, apart from its U-boat arm. And the U-boat arm is really all that Germany has to really threaten the Allies, specifically Britain. The U-boats are a big threat, but they can be contained by escorts, and it, to a certain extent, is a one-dimensional threat. Either enough merchant ships get through, or they don't. Whereas in the Mediterranean, the Italian Navy presents a multi-dimensional threat. They have their own submarine arm, which does score some interesting successes, but they also are the ones who are in charge of keeping the supply lines to North Africa open. So that whole North Africa campaign, everyone goes, oh, yes, Rommel and the Africa Corps. If it wasn't for the Italian Navy, that campaign would have been over very, very quickly because he would have run out of supplies. So they're keeping the supply route to North Africa open. They're enabling that entire campaign to go along. And sometimes North Africa gets dismissed as a sideshow. Sometimes what people don't realize is that it's not just about the Suez Canal, although that is quite important. The Suez Canal's overall importance to merchant shipping has been reduced somewhat in the opening years of World War II, because, of course, you can't transit the full length of the Mediterranean safely. So as a trade route, it's not really so important, but it is very important to keeping the Mediterranean fleet supplied and stocked with shipping. The problem is essentially goes all the way back, to the age of sail, back when Napoleon invaded Egypt. The big fear wasn't that Napoleon was going to invade Egypt, which wasn't very valuable at the time. The problem was that once you've invaded Egypt, if you start heading east, there's not a tremendous amount apart from distance to stop you from hitting India. And India, back in the age of sail, was the crown jewel in the British Empire. And in World War II, to a certain extent, still is the crown jewel of the British Empire. And especially in World War II, especially post December 7th, 1941, there is the nightmare, if somewhat stretching scenario, of the Axis powers meeting up, because the Japanese are coming into India from the east. So it's not a small matter that there are large Axis armies in North Africa. A lot of those troops are Italian, and as we said, all their supplies are being supplied by the Italians. Also, fun fact, when you see all the air combat going around in the Mediterranean theater, people see Stukas diving in left, right, and center, and they automatically associate that with the Luftwaffe. And yes, Fleet Corps 10 is there, but a huge chunk of those Ju-87s are actually Regia Aeronautica Ju-87s being flown by Italian pilots. Then, of course, we have the Malta convoys. So Malta is a vital strategic linchpin for the Royal Navy, not just to try and interdict the Axis convoys running to North Africa, but also to maintain a continuity of not necessarily control, but at least contesting the Mediterranean. And of course, whilst the Italian Navy doesn't try and invade Malta, the Allies have to resupply Malta with convoys, much the same as we have to resupply the UK with convoys. But again, I think this kind of brings up an interesting point. So flip over to the next slide. When you think of a convoy that's coming to the UK, so this is a convoy that's under threat from the Kriegsmarine, what are the escorts? Sloops, armed trawlers, corvettes, frigates, the occasional cruiser. In the early days, when they're a little bit worried about one of the German fast battleships getting out into the Atlantic, maybe you'll have a single old battleship tootling along for the ride. When you are running a convoy to Malta and your threat is a potential deployment by the Regia Marina, you deploy multiple aircraft carriers, multiple battleships, multiple squadrons of cruisers, multiple flotillas of destroyers. The forces that are sent on some of these convoy missions to Malta won't be equaled in scope or scale until the Royal Navy starts to put together full fleets to deal with the Japanese. Back, especially with this particular one you can see on the right, where there's 3 aircraft carriers. You won't see 3 Royal Navy fleet carriers operating together until the British Pacific Fleet is formed. These are serious operations, and they're taking some of the biggest and nastiest ships that the Royal Navy has and throwing them on what seems like a fairly simple convoy escort mission, just in case the Regia Mariner comes out to play. And the Regia Mariner itself makes repeated sorties. Again, when you compare and contrast that to the Kriegsmarine, if we just look at the battleships, because they're the smallest number of vessels, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, they do Operation Berlin. And as far as their merchant raiding career is concerned, that's pretty much it. That's the high point. They then spend quite a bit of time holed up in Brest. So they do the Channel Dash. Gneisenau never really recovers from that because she gets bombed in port. Scharnhorst goes up to haunt the Norwegian waters, tries to attack a convoy and gets sunk by Duke of York. Bismarck, of course, goes out, never attacks a single merchantman, blows up Hood, gets blown up by Rodney and King George V in return. So not a brilliant return on investment. And of course, Tirpitz goes out to attack one convoy, runs away, is chased by some albacores, which don't manage to catch it, and then gets nibbled to death by a billion little cats in the form of the Fleet Air Arm and the Royal Navy and 617 Squadron. Then you look at the records for, Giulio Cesare, Andrea Doria, Duilio, Vittorio Veneto, and Littorio. Roma, not so much, because Roma comes into commission right towards the end. But the main Italian battleships are making repeated sorties every year to try and either challenge the Royal Navy directly, or more often to try and interdict and attack these convoys. The fact that they don't necessarily always succeed in intercepting the convoys is somewhat secondary to the point that they're actually actively trying. And occasionally you do get battles like Cape Spartivento where they come close. And, if a Italian battleship's deployed 5, 6, 7, and 8 times in the course of the war or more to try and attack convoys, that's a much, much bigger threat than a battleship that sails once. And it kind of goes on like this with the Malta convoys, as I said, and then we switch over to the next slide. The Italian Navy also has a remarkable degree of success that often goes unsung. So obviously everyone's heard of Bismarck versus Hood, but that ends up quite badly for Bismarck in the end. But all of these images are representatives of just one unit of the Italian fleet. So 10th Flotilla, they're essentially what we would call today their naval special forces. And these guys are really effective and pioneer a lot of advanced underwater warfare techniques, I should say, which really form the basis of a lot of underwater warfare even to this day. So we have on the top left and bottom left, we have HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant, modernized Queen Elizabeth class battleships, probably some of the most valuable combatants that the Royal Navy possesses at the time. And they're sitting quite happily in Alexandria Harbour, which is heavily defended. But the Italians managed to stick what they call, I think it's maiale. I apologize. I know there's at least one Italian listening to this if I mispronounce that. But they're called manned torpedoes, which is a little bit of a misnomer because something like a Japanese Kai-10 is a manned torpedo. These things are torpedo-shaped, essentially very, very tiny underwater subs. And these things are mounted on an Italian sub, which gets close enough to Alexandria to launch them. And then you have 2 guys in what are essentially scuba suits, one generation removed from them actually being scuba suits, but a lot more advanced than your kind of standard diving equipment of World War II, which is your classic, almost cartoonish, stereotypical big canvas suit with a massive brass bell on your head. And they managed to penetrate the defenses of Alexandria, and they plant a series of charges under Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, which then go on to explode and knock them out of the war for a considerable period of time. There is a lot of argument back and forth as to whether or not they technically count as sunk, because they take on a lot of water. There's certainly, in fact, the top left picture, that is Queen Elizabeth after she has been hit by 10th Flotilla. There's some debate as to whether or not the bottoms of the ship are touching the seabed. So do they technically count as sunk or just badly damaged? It doesn't really matter. The effect is that they have been knocked out of the war at a time when the Royal Navy really doesn't need to be repairing two of their near enough brand new battleships, considering they've both only just come out of modernization in the past couple of years. On the top right, we have what's left of poor old HMS York over in Suda Bay. This was an above water attack, and in this case it was explosive motorboats. So pretty much as it says, a fast motorboat packed full of explosive, couple of people driving it, and because this isn't the Japanese and we're not talking kamikazes, they bail a few hundred yards short of the thing hitting. Wrecks HMS York. And if there's one thing the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean really, really needs, well, it needs everything, but what they really need in terms of what they never really get for very long is heavy cruisers, 8-inch gun cruisers. Whilst HMS York isn't the best armored, the best heavy cruiser in the world, she is still a heavy cruiser, and the loss of her is quite an annoying blow for the Mediterranean fleet. Multiple times in various encounters between Royal Navy and Regia Marina cruisers, the fact that Regia Marina can put 4, 5, 6, at least until Matapan, 8-inch heavy cruisers in play really complicates things for the Royal Navy, because they've got plenty of cruisers with 6-inch guns and 5.25-inch guns, but the Italian cruisers can just flat out outrange them. So large numbers of encounters on a fleet scale between Royal Navy and Regia Marina cruisers involve the Royal Navy cruisers going, there are the Italian cruisers. Great. Now let's all run away under smoke and essentially run at very, very high speed in the direction of the battleships, of course, have even bigger and even more long-range guns. Whereas if the Royal Navy was able to build up a force of its own 8-inch cruisers, they could actually stand up and fight in a sort of a fair fight, if there ever is such a thing in war. But HMS York is destroyed, so that rules that out, and that's 10th Flotillas again. And then finally on the bottom right, we have Gibraltar, and as we can see there, Gibraltar World War II, a very busy harbour. It's the sort of exit point for ships that are leaving the Med. It's the entry point for ships going into the Med, especially a lot of ships coming to the Malta convoys. And 10th Flotilla pulls off an absolutely wonderful piece of deception. So for those of you who've been to Gibraltar, you'll know this is obviously looking at the rock, kind of beneath the cameraman taking this photo. You've got the Spanish side of things. And on the Spanish side of things, there's a partially sunken freighter, which has a wonderful view of the harbour of Gibraltar, the British side. Nobody particularly cares about it. It's a rusted out freighter, whatever. 10th Flotilla rock up. They have, again, their little manned underwater propulsion units, and they cut a hole in this freighter underwater and turn it into something like out of a James Bond film. It's a literal semi-submerged underwater base. They hide in the freighter. They can obviously look quite happily out on the harbour from the freighter, and for an extremely long period of time, they can just leave when they want to, head out obviously underwater across the harbour, put explosive charges on shipping. The military part of Gibraltar is a bit more heavily guarded, so they tend to go for the merchant ships, and then they head back, and then a few hours later ships start randomly exploding. And for the entire Italian involvement in World War II, no one can figure out why ships in Gibraltar are randomly exploding. Because you're going, well, we haven't spotted any submarines coming in. We've got ridiculous numbers of submarine nets at the entrance to the harbour. They've all been monitored. There haven't been any breaches in security. And frankly, some of these ships have been moored in position such that if there was a submarine in the parts of the harbour that you could have a submarine in, we would have seen the torpedoes, and the torpedoes probably would have hit something on the way. And so what on earth is going on? And it's kind of almost like a slightly more explosive version of hide and seek. The Italians pop up at the end of the conflict and go, hello, we were here all along. And then the last bit, which I'll come to, because I know we're running out of time, is when you look at Operation Husky and Operation Avalanche, the invasions of Sicily and the invasion of Italy itself, compared to D-Day, Operation Overlord, on D-Day, there are battleships present in the Allied fleet. Those battleships are old ships. They're pretty much there entirely to bombard the coastline and make the Germans' day a little bit worse. When it comes to the invasion of Sicily and Italy, there are more Allied battleships. They're much more modern, much more heavy-hitting Allied battleships, and their job is anything but shore bombardment. Their job is to act as a screen just in case the Regia Mariner comes out to play, because the Regia Mariner does have the force to come out and really mess up the Allied landings. As it turns out, there are actually orders for the Regia Mariner to do that when it comes to the landings in Italy, but the armistice comes pretty much just as they're steaming up, ready to go. Whereas even if the Germans had wanted to sail out on D-Day to interfere with the D-Day landings, they flat out just didn't have the forces to do so. The Italians did.
Well, fantastic. We're on time. Just have time, Drac, for a couple of quick questions if you're ruthlessly strict with your answers. Peter O'Connell is saying, was the quality control issue with Italian gunnery due to propellant consistency or an other issue? You've got like one sentence to say something.
It's very debated, very mixed. There are three possible causes, each one of which is plausible and each one of which interplays with the others. So I do plan on exploring that in more detail at some point in the future.
Brilliant, we can do that. And this is a good one, I think, from Josh White here. The lack of an iconic naval victory probably contributes. I mean, that there's lots of these little collective kind of add them all together contributions, but there isn't that kind of that midway, that Leyte Gulf, Trafalgar type battle. Would you concur with that?
Yes, that probably is the case. I mean, the only kind of major naval victory in the Mediterranean that you can point to as a gun action is Matapan, which obviously goes the British way. But even then, Matapan, if we're honest, we managed to catch a bunch of cruisers as kind of the leavings. We wanted Vittorio Veneto. Vittorio Veneto got away. So yeah, but I think at the same time, this also emphasizes how good the Italians were in that you've got one good but not what we wanted victory over them at sea. They managed to hold off the Allies actually getting a big victory against them all other times, whereas with the Germans, you've got the sinking of Bismarck, you've got the sinking of Scharnhorst. There's quite a few naval engagements where the Germans take a bit of a pasting. The Italians, apart from Matapan, generally managed to avoid that in the open ocean.
Thank you. And my last one, again, just to sum things up, they will say thank you, is do you think this is one of those myths that we're going to be stuck with, like Napoleon being short, Roosevelt knowing about Pearl Harbor? Are we going to be forever talking about the idea the Italians were hopeless in World War II, or will we move on from that? Do you think, as a kind of a historian yourself?
I think we are slowly moving on from it. More sources are being translated out of Italian. The theatre itself is coming into more awareness, and more Italian historians are bringing their points of view forward. So I think it is gradually changing. But as with a lot of these kinds of myths, entrenched views do take some shifting.
Yeah, it'll be evolution rather than revolution. But we will end things there, Drac. People are saying I should invite you back for a longer format show, so we can try and do that at some point in the future. But right now, we're going to reconvene in 6 minutes' time with Jenny Grant to talk about the myth of the Allies standing alone, or Britain standing alone in 1940. So thank you, Drac. If for any reason you're watching this and you've not discovered his website, I don't know, and YouTube channel, I don't know how that would have been at all possible. The links are in the description below. And if you are a new person joining me because of Drac's channel, welcome aboard. So in both cases, the links will be below. So thanks, Drac. Thanks, viewers. I will see you all again in 5 minutes' time. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye.